They banned my rain barrel as an eyesore, so I dug a pond with a full ecosystem and solar foggers. I stood in my front yard, arms crossed, staring at the crumpled notice taped to my rain barrel. The paper was already curling at the edges, ink smearing from the morning dew, but the words were seared into my brain. Violation of HOA regulations. Unsightly structure. Remove within 48 hours or face fines. My rain barrel, my pride. My small rebellion against the drought strangling our little suburban hellscape was an eyesore. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled a passing jogger. An eyesore? In a neighborhood of cookie-cutter lawns and plastic flamingos, my barrel was the problem? I ripped the notice off, the tape leaving a sticky scar on the barrel's chipped blue paint. Karen, the HOA president, had been gunning for me since I moved in. It started with my wildflower garden, which she called a weed infestation. Then my compost bin, which she swore attracted rats, though the only pest I'd seen was her sniffing around my property line. Now this. I could picture her, clipboard in hand, her platinum bob gleaming under the streetlights, scribbling her petty edicts. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was waging war on anything that didn't scream conformity. I wasn't going to take it lying down. Not this time. That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of cheap Merlot, scrolling through gardening forums. My barrel wasn't just a water collector. It was a lifeline. Last summer, when the county slapped watering bans on us, my tomatoes and zucchini thrived, while Karen's manicured lawn turned to straw. I needed a solution, something bold, something that screamed screw you without breaking the law. That's when I stumbled on a post about backyard ponds. Not those sad, plastic-lined puddles, but full ecosystems. Fish, plants, frogs, the works. A pond could store water, support wildlife, and make my yard a sanctuary. And the best part? HOAs couldn't regulate what was natural. By midnight, I was obsessed. I sketched plans on a napkin, wine stains blooming like flowers around my scribbles. A pond, 6 feet wide, 3 feet deep, with native plants and a solar-powered fogger for that misty, magical vibe. I'd call it a water feature, classy enough to dodge Karen's wrath. I fell asleep dreaming of koi fish darting through lily pads, their scales catching the sunlight, while Karen choked on her decaf latte. The next morning, I was at the hardware store before it opened, loading my cart with shovels, pond liner, and a pump. The cashier, a kid with a nose ring, raised an eyebrow. "Big project?" he asked. I grinned. "Revenge project." He nodded like he got it. Maybe he had his own Karen. Digging started that afternoon. The Georgia clay fought me every inch, red and sticky, clinging to my boots like it resented being disturbed. Sweat stung my eyes, and my shoulders screamed, but every spadeful felt like defiance. Neighbors slowed their cars, gawking. Mrs. Delaney, the sweet old widow next door, brought me lemonade and whispered, "Give him hell, hon." I toasted her with my glass. Dirt smudged across my cheek. By day 3, the hole was deep enough to make my knees weak. I was hauling out a bucket of clay when a shadow fell over me. I looked up, and there she was, Karen, in a crisp white blouse and sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Her lips were a thin, bloodless line. "What?" she said, each word clipped. "Is this?" I leaned on my shovel, wiping sweat from my brow. "A water feature," I said, all innocence. "Eco-friendly. Supports local wildlife. You love nature, right, Karen?" Her eyes narrowed, scanning the muddy chaos of my yard. I could practically hear her brain flipping through the rulebook, searching for a violation. But I checked. No permits needed for a pond this size. No HOA clause against it. She was out of moves. "This better not flood my yard," she snapped finally. And she stalked off, her heels sinking into the grass. I saluted her back with my shovel, humming to myself. Round 2 was mine. The pond took shape over the next week. I lined it with black rubber, smoothed the edges with river rocks, and planted water hyacinths and pickerel weed, their roots trailing like green veins. I ordered koi from a breeder 2 states over, naming them after my favorite sci-fi villains Vader, Thanos, and a tiny, feisty one called Loki. A solar fogger arrived, and when I tested it, mist curled up like spirits rising from the water, catching the sunset in a prism of color. It was beautiful. It was winning. But Karen wasn't surrender. She sent emails, CCNG the entire HOA board, whining about potential mosquito breeding grounds and aesthetic disruptions. I fired back with articles on pond ecosystems, citing how dragonflies, nature's mosquito assassins, would thrive. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up with a slideshow, photos of my pond, data on water conservation, even a petition signed by half the neighborhood. Mrs. Delaney clapped when I finished. Karen's face was a storm cloud, but the board voted to let the pond stay. I walked home feeling like a general who'd just won a siege. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. One morning, as I sipped coffee on my porch, a beat-up van rumbled into the cul-de-sac. A man hopped out, wiry and sunburned, with a toolbox and a grin that showed too many teeth. "You the pond lady?" he called. I nodded, wary. He introduced himself as Ray, a freelance landscaper hired by an anonymous client to enhance my pond. I smelled Karen's handiwork, some sneaky sabotage dressed up as a gift. But Ray seemed genuine, rattling off ideas about adding a waterfall or floating lotus beds. Against my better judgment, I let him poke around. Ray was a talker, sharing stories of gigs gone wrong. A fountain that sprayed a wedding party, a hedge sculpted into something unprintable. He had a disarming charm, and by noon, I was laughing despite myself. He sketched a plan for a small waterfall, promising it'd stay within HOA rules. No charge, he insisted. Clients footing the bill. I should have said no, but the pond would look amazing with a waterfall. I gave him the green light. The waterfall went up in a day, a cascade of water that made the pond sing. Ray even tossed in a frog he'd rescued from a little guy he called Kermit, who promptly claimed a rock as his kingdom. I was starting to like Ray, this oddball who seemed to love chaos as much as I did. But that night, I found a note slipped under my door, typed in Karen's telltale Arial font. "Enjoy your swamp while it lasts." My gut churned. What had I missed? The next morning, I inspected the waterfall. It was perfect, too perfect. I dug around the base, and there, hidden under a rock, was a tiny valve connected to a hose. Not a water feature hose. A sewer hose. Karen hadn't hired Ray to enhance my pond. She'd paid him to rig it to flood my yard with wastewater. If the pond became a health hazard, she'd have grounds to force me to fill it in. I yanked the hose out, fury burning through me. Ray had played me. I confronted him that afternoon. He was back, toolbox in hand, whistling like nothing was wrong. "You lied to me," I said, holding up the hose. His grin faltered, and for a moment, I saw something raw in his eyes, shame, maybe, or fear. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "She's got dirt on me. Said she'd ruin me if I pressed him." And he spilled. Karen had caught him dumping clippings in a protected wetland years ago. She'd held it over him ever since, forcing him into her dirty work. He hadn't wanted to hurt me. He'd even tried to make the sabotage subtle, hoping I'd catch it in time. I should have called the cops. Instead, I handed Ray a beer and asked, "Want to get even?" His grin returned, slower this time, but with a glint of mischief. We hatched a plan. Karen wanted a spectacle? Oh, we'd give her one. Over the next few days, Ray and I turned the pond into a masterpiece. We added more plants, tuned the fogger to glow under LED lights, and released a school of minnows that danced in the current. We spread the word quietly, inviting neighbors to a pond unveiling party. Mrs. brought her famous cornbread. Kids from down the street made signs with glitter glue. The night of the party, the yard was packed, music playing, fireflies flickering. Even the HOA board showed up, drawn by the buzz. Karen arrived last, her face sour as she saw the crowd. I raised a glass to her, all smiles, and handed her a flyer I'd printed. "Welcome to the Karen Harmony Pond, dedicated to our HOA president for inspiring community unity." Her eyes bulged. The name was a jab, but the dedication was ironclad. She couldn't tear down a pond named after her without looking like a monster. The crowd cheered, oblivious to the shade. Ray winked at me from the sidelines. Kermit the Frog perched on his cap. For a moment, I felt untouchable. The pond was safe, Karen was humiliated, and I'd turned her own game against her. But victory is a fragile thing, and the story of Karen's revenge and the price of my defiance was far from over. The party was a triumph, the kind of night that felt like it could rewrite the rules of our stuffy little neighborhood. Laughter echoed over the pond's misty surface. Kids chased fireflies, and even the stiffest HOA board members loosened up, sipping lemonade and marveling at the koi. Karen stood at the edge of the crowd, her smile brittle as cracked glass, clutching her purse like a lifeline. I caught her eye and raised my glass again, savoring the way her jaw tightened. Checkmate, I thought. But life, like any good story, doesn't let you win that cleanly. The next morning, I woke to a strange quiet. The pond's pump, usually a soft hum, was silent. I stumbled outside in my pajamas, heart sinking as I saw the water murky, still, with a faint, sour smell. The koi floated belly up, their vibrant scales dulled. Vader, Thanos, Loki all gone. The fogger was dead, its solar panel cracked. I knelt by the edge, hands trembling, and found a thin film of oil shimmering on the surface. Poison. Someone had poisoned my pond. I knew it was Karen. No proof, not yet, but her name burned in my mind like a brand. I called Ray, my voice shaking with rage. He showed up an hour later, his usual grin gone, replaced by a grim set to his mouth. I didn't do this, he said before I could accuse him. But I know who did. He confessed he'd overheard Karen on a call, bragging to someone about fixing the swamp problem. She'd waited until the party ended, when everyone's guard was down, and dumped something toxic into the water. Ray didn't know what motor oil, pesticide, something cheap and deadly. She's not just petty, he said, kicking a rock into the grass. She's unhinged. I wanted to storm her house, to scream, to tear her perfect azaleas out by the roots. But I'd learned something from Karen's playbook. Rage without strategy is just noise. So I swallowed my grief for the koi, for the pond that had become my heart, and started planning. Ray, still guilty over the hose stunt, was all in. Mrs. Delaney, who'd heard the news and shuffled over with tears in her eyes, insisted on helping too. That woman's a blight, she said, clutching her cane. Let's blight her back. We needed evidence. Karen was too smart to leave fingerprints, but she wasn't invisible. Ray suggested checking her trash, risky, but worth a shot. Under cover of night, we crept to her curb, where her bins sat like sentinels. I felt ridiculous, like a teenager pulling a prank, but the stakes were higher than pride. We found it in the recycling, an empty jug of herbicide, its label stained with oily residue. It wasn't airtight proof, but it was enough to take to the board. I snapped photos, my hands shaking with adrenaline, and we slipped back to my house, hearts pounding. The next step was trickier. Karen had influence, friends on the board who'd look the other way unless we made it impossible. So we went public. I posted the photos on the neighborhood social media group, along with a heartfelt post about the pond, how it wasn't just water, but a home for fish, frogs, and dragonflies, a stand against the drought, a gift to the community. I didn't name Karen outright, but I didn't have to. The comments exploded. Neighbors who'd been at the party were furious. Kids who'd named the koi posted crying emojis. Even the board members, spineless as they were, couldn't ignore the uproar. Karen fought back, of course. She stormed into the next HOA meeting, waving a lawyer's letter claiming defamation. But the tide had turned. Mrs. Delaney, bless her, stood up, her voice quavering but fierce, and read a letter from her grandson, a biology major, explaining how herbicide runoff could poison local streams. The room went quiet. Karen's face turned the color of her overbleached teeth. The board voted to investigate, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. But the real twist came a week later, and it wasn't from Karen. It was Ray. I'd invited him over to help clean the pond. We were draining the water, scrubbing the liner, trying to salvage what we could. He was quieter than usual, his jokes half-hearted. As we hauled out the last of the muck, he sat on a rock, staring at Kermit the Frog, who'd somehow survived the poisoning. I gotta tell you something, he said, his voice low. I braced myself, expecting another HOA plot. Instead, he told me about his daughter. Her name was Lila, 7 years old, living with his ex-wife across town. She had leukemia, diagnosed a year ago. Ray's landscaping gigs barely covered his rent, let alone her medical bills. That's why he'd taken Karen's dirty jobs, not just the hose, but other small sabotages around the neighborhood, things I'd never connected to him. I didn't want to hurt you, he said, his eyes wet. But Karen knew about Lila. She paid me extra, said she'd tip off the cops about that wetland thing if I didn't do what she wanted. I was trapped. I sat there, stunned, the shovel limp in my hands. Ray, the charming screw-up, the guy I'd pegged as a lovable rogue, was carrying a weight I couldn't imagine. My anger at him fizzled, replaced by something heavier, pity, maybe, or respect. Why tell me now? I asked. He shrugged, tossing a pebble into the empty pond. You didn't deserve this. And Lila, she'd hate me if she knew I was hurting people to help her. That night, I couldn't sleep. The pond, the koi, even Karen's vendetta felt small next to Ray's story. I thought about Lila, a kid I'd never met, fighting a battle bigger than any HOA feud. I thought about my own fight, how it had started as a middle finger to Karen but had grown into something more a symbol of resistance, of life in a place obsessed with control. And I realized I couldn't let it end in poison and pettiness. The next day, I called a meeting not with the HOA but with the neighborhood. I stood by the empty pond, Ray and Mrs. Delaney at my side, and told everyone the truth about the herbicide, Karen's sabotage, and Ray's confession. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told them about Lila, too, because her story deserved to be heard. Then I made a proposal. We'd rebuild the pond, bigger, better, and crowdfunded as a community. Not just for me, but for every kid like Lila, every person who needed a reminder that beauty could outlast cruelty. I'd donate the first $100, and any extra would go to Lila's treatment. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors I barely knew pledged money, plants, even labor. Kids offered their piggy banks. Mrs. Delaney baked cookies to sell at a fundraiser. By the end of the week, we had enough to start over and a check for Ray, who cried when I handed it to him. Karen, meanwhile, was ousted from the HOA presidency in a landslide vote. She didn't show her face at the next meeting, and rumor had it she was selling her house. I didn't care. She wasn't worth my energy anymore. Rebuilding the pond took weeks. We dug deeper, added a filtration system, planted native grasses that swayed in the breeze. New koi arrived: Ripley, Leia, and a tiny one named Lila, who darted like she owned the place. The solar fogger hummed again, casting rainbows over the water. At the second unveiling, the neighborhood turned out in force, and when Kermit the Frog croaked from his rock, the kids cheered like it was a rock concert. But the story doesn't end with a neat bow. A month later, Ray called me, his voice breaking. Lila's treatment had failed. She was gone. The money we'd raised had eased her last weeks, but it couldn't save her. I stood by the pond, staring at the koi, and wept for a girl I'd never known, for a father who'd fought in the only way he could. The pond was beautiful, alive, a testament to what we'd built together, but it was also a reminder of what we couldn't fix. I visit the pond every morning now, watching Lila the koi chase the others through the mist. It's a small act of defiance against a world that breaks your heart. Karen's gone. Her house sold to a young couple who love the pond. But the victory feels hollow sometimes, shadowed by the cost. I wonder if I'd do it all again, if I'd dig that first shovelful knowing what I know now. I think I would. Not for revenge, but for the people who showed up, who made something beautiful out of spite and sorrow. What do you think? Was it worth it? Did I fight the right battle, or did I lose sight of what mattered? Share your thoughts, because in a world of Karens and broken dreams, we're all just trying to figure out what's right.